Tonight, 24 million pounds of molasses comes barreling down on a neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm Richard.
And I'm Gary, and these are our incredible stories. Hello and welcome back to all of our listeners from around the world and across the United States. We're happy to have you back with us for some more exciting, amazing stories. And let me tell you, folks, we have a doozy of a story for you today.
Do we?
Yeah. And the thing is, I had shared this story with you, Dad, and it's one that you hadn't heard of.
No.
And I only came across it because I was at a Scholastic book fair at my school, and they had the I Survived book series out. And one of the books was I Survived the Great Molasses Flood. And I thought to myself, that's ridiculous. How could an entire town be flooded with molasses?
Yeah.
And how could something so sticky and delicious be so deadly?
Yeah.
It turns out it was real, and it was catastrophic.
Absolutely. And Gary, it's interesting how sometimes we run across our incredible stories. And like you say, this one you came across by accident. I consider myself pretty up to date on historical events, but I sure had never heard of this incident before. And so
I'm willing to bet a lot of people don't know about this.
No. So it's going to be incredible tonight.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody go ahead and sit back, relax, and at the end of the story, we'll just ponder about, how important our lives are and how they can be changed, really, in the wink of an eye.
By sticky syrup.
Yeah. The children's book that you ran across called it The Great Molasses Flood. Gary, it's also known as the Boston Molasses Disaster. So if somebody were to research this on Google or whatever, they could find it either with the Great Molasses Flood or the Boston Molasses Disaster. Now, it happened way, way back, more than 100 years ago, January 15th, 1919, in the North End neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. Now, 1919 was the year after World War I had come to an end.
Yes.
Yeah, so we had just come through a world war. We had come through, remember that flu panic that occurred then? And
Yes. The first pandemic that the United States went through.
So that was a serious pandemic that the country had just come through, and World War, we had just come through that. And now we have something catastrophic. I'm looking, as I'm talking to you, I'm looking at the front page of the Boston Post from back then, and there is a huge headline that spreads across the entire page. It says, "Huge molasses tank explodes in North End, 11 dead, 50 hurt."
Oh, my gosh. Terrifying.
Yes. And so what we had there was, it was a large storage tank, and it had 2.3 million gallons of molasses.
That's a lot of molasses.
Sure. It weighed approximately 12,000 tons. So I did the math. 12,000 tons times 2,000 pounds in each ton. We're looking at 24 million pounds of sticky molasses that comes crashing down on this neighborhood.
Holy cow.
And that wave of molasses, it ran through the streets, Gary, at an estimated 35 miles per hour. So guess what? If you saw it coming, there was no way to escape it.
How is it moving so fast? Molasses is the slowest moving thing I've ever seen.
I know.
You try and pour that out of a jar, it takes about 12 minutes for it to hit the toast.
Yeah, that's right.
For whatever reason, it took 30 miles an hour coming out of a tank.
35 miles an hour. Well, I think it was because it was such a humongous weight, a humongous volume that just gave it that speed. And actually, it injured 150 people. It killed 21 of them. And for decades, not just a few years, but for decades afterwards, Gary, you could go in that area and you could still smell molasses.
Oh my gosh!
Years and years later.
That's a lot of processed sugar. Because I'm looking it up because I was thinking molasses. Does that come from trees like syrup? But it actually comes from either sugar beets or sugar cane. That's a lot of harvesting and processing of sugar.
Yeah.
To get that much molasses. Why would they need to make that much? I mean,
how did it happen? In other words,
that's my. Besides the fact that that's a lot of molasses, how could something so catastrophic happen that people were killed by such sticky goodness?
And now the rest of the story.
Oh, here we go. Channel that Paul Harvey.
Yeah. January 15, 1919.
Bum, bum, bum.
The temperatures in Boston had risen above 40 degrees, and now I was born in and used to live in, as a child, New England.
Yeah.
I phrased that kind of awkwardly, didn't I? I used to live in New England as a child.
Did you now?
That sounds better, doesn't it?
That does sound better.
And I can tell you from experience that New England winters can be harsh. And I
Sure they
mean
can.
cold with a capital K or C.
C.
Okay. So anyways, 40 degrees, I mean, that was kind of temperate when you consider a New England winter. But the preceding days, it had been frigid. And so the day before, January 14th, a ship came in, and it delivered a fresh load of molasses. And in order for the ship to transfer the molasses to the storage tank, Gary, they had to warm it because, as you were mentioning, its viscosity, how it takes forever when you try and pour it. So if you warm it, it tends to move a little faster.
Of course.
So when that warm molasses from the ship, and I don't know how many pounds it was, but it was a substantial cargo load.
I believe it was.
Hit the older, colder molasses that was already inside the tank, there was a thermal expansion, and the tank burst open and collapsed.
Oh, okay. Well, now going back to Bill Nye the Science Guy, I remember an episode where he was talking about heat and cold. Cold causes things to contract. Heat causes things to expand.
And when you're talking about 24 million pounds of a substance, I don't know many metals that are going to withhold some problems like that.
Oh, you can say that again.
So this happened about 30 minutes after noon. People were on their lunch hours. Witnesses reported that they actually felt the ground shake. And you know what? When you're talking about 24 million of pounds of substance hitting the ground, I imagine it did shake.
Yeah.
And it wasn't silent either. They heard it a roar, what they described as a roar. And some people reported it as a tremendous crashing. Then they thought they heard something like a machine gun. And those were the rivets that held the tank together or on its braces.
Oh, just shooting out all over the place?
Rivets shooting out of the tank.
Woo!
And that could kill you. You get hit by an exploding rivet.
Oh my gosh, yeah. It's something that's shooting out that quickly from something, would be traveling as fast as a bullet.
I remember watching a couple of those U-boat movies, and the U-boats are submerged deep, and the rivets start to shoot out, and you can hear them blink, 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 and so, that's pretty scary in and of itself. So we've got cascading molasses. We've got a tank shooting out rivets. A streetcar was even thrown off the tracks.
Really?
Yeah. And nearby buildings were just swept off their foundations and crushed.
By all of this molasses.
Yeah. But that's not too hard to believe because we've seen buildings destroyed by floods.
Sure. I got to pull up some pictures to kind of get a visual on this.
Okay.
I know it was a lot.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think, because when I think of some of these tankers, in my head, I guess I'm imagining, like the water tanks that you see in certain towns and stuff.
Oh, this had to be
or silos
huge.
And stuff.
This had to be huge.
All right, let's see. I'm pulling up molasses floods on Google.
Okay, and several blocks were flooded up to 3 feet. Now, 3 feet of molasses flooding, you're talking about the molasses coming up above your tires. in your cars and your trucks, or
Oh, yeah.
you're talking about them coming up above your tires. Nothing was going to move in that mess.
No, of course not.
Now, there was an eyewitness reported in this issue of the Boston Post that I'm looking at here. His name was Stephen Puleo, and this is what he said. These are his words. Molasses waist deep covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell.
Oh, my gosh.
Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper.
Oh.
The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise.
Wow.
Can you imagine? Oh, that must have been horrifying. Watching people struggling in this almost like liquid quicksand.
Or like tar.
Yeah.
I think like the La Brea tar pits,
Yeah.
I'm looking at the footage, or not footage, but the photographs right now, and I'm telling you, it is a wide area.
Oh, yeah.
A wide area of just sticky molasses all over the place.
Oh, yeah, there was so much molasses it wouldn't just take up a couple blocks. That's
I mean,
for sure.
it's literally the whole area and the buildings. I mean, it's just absolute rubble.
Now, this Boston Globe newspaper that I'm looking at said that people were picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet.
Really?
Yeah, others had debris hurled at them. A truck was picked up and hurled into the harbor.
So that sounds like the explosion.
Yeah. People were trapped in the wave, and that made it even more difficult to rescue them. About 150 people were injured, 21 people and several horses killed. Some were crushed and drowned by the molasses. Just imagine. Oh.
So they have, to give you a little bit of scale here, let me see if I can turn it around so that you can see. They're showing what the silo looked like before, and it's a fairly large silo. Let me see if I can turn this around without knocking stuff off the table.
Okay. While Gary is doing that, let me just mention the rescue efforts that got underway. The Boston Police, the Red Cross, Army, Navy personnel arrived soon. Some nurses from the Red Cross actually dived into the molasses. And then they tried to tend to the injured. They tried to keep them warm. Rescuers found it difficult to make their way through the syrup to help the victims. And after 4 days went by, they finally, I'm looking at the photo. Oh, my good grief. Yeah, that's
Look how giant
else.
that silo was.
Yeah, and the horses are running away in terror.
Oh, my gosh,
The police officer. The rescuers found it difficult to make their way through that syrup. And 4 days had gone by before they finally stopped searching. And many of the dead, Gary, they were so glazed over in molasses that they were hard to recognize.
Oh, my gosh.
And there were other victims that were actually swept into Boston Harbor, and they weren't found until 3 or 4 months later.
It's kind of like, what was the name of that eruption, volcanic eruption that covered everybody in ash?
Mount Vesuvius?
No.
Vesuvius.
Pompeii.
Pompeii, yeah.
Yeah, where everybody was covered in ashes and they were frozen in that situation.
That's a great example from ancient history.
Yeah, but instead of these fossilized mummies, you had like candy-coated mummies. That's pretty much it. I mean, literally preserved in sugar, glazed mummies.
Yeah, and we can see them in their last moment of life, preserved forever. That's a great.
Well, Pompeii, but this one, I mean,
great example from ancient history.
Yeah,
and this is a modern day event.
But with molasses
related to that. Now the cleanup crews, they had to use salt water from a fireboat to wash away the molasses and sand to absorb it. And the harbor was brown with molasses until the summer. Now remember, this was in January, so 6 months later, they were still dealing with molasses. Rescue workers and cleanup crews and sightseers, they had tracked the molasses, Gary, through the streets, and they spread it to the subway platforms, to the seats inside the trains and streetcars.
I believe
To
that.
the pay phones outside, into their homes. It was reported that everything that a Bostonian touched back then was sticky.
I believe it.
Isn't that
I mean,
awful? Now I have a list of the
Jiminy
people
cricket.
who were killed in this, Gary.
Uh,
And what I've done is I've singled a couple out based on age. The oldest victim was a fellow by the name of Michael Sinnott, and he was 78 years old.
uh-huh.
And the youngest were two children aged 10, Maria D'Estasio and Pasquale Iantasca. So the victims ranged in age from 10 to 78 years old. Then the other thing I found interesting was some of their professions. Bridget Clougherty, she was 65 and a homemaker, a housewife. She passed away.
Yeah.
Then there was an unemployed man, Stephen Clougherty. He was 34. And then, believe it or not, there were two blacksmiths. Peter Francis, he was 64, and John Seiberlich, he was 69. Back then, they didn't have Social Security, and they didn't have retirement or anything.
Oh, no,
so,
no.
I mean, people worked till they dropped. So two working blacksmiths in their 60s were among the victims here. And I noticed there was a 17-year-old who was listed as a teamster. Now, we have another one, Ralph Martin. He was a driver, so I assume that was maybe a truck. I think the teamsters refers to people who are driving horse-drawn wagons.
Weren't they part of the union?
Yeah. Eventually, that covered, truckers and things. But I think it started with the horse-drawn wagons. So I think probably a horse and wagon, and Eric Laird, who was 17, got caught up in the huge flood. Wow. So I tell you what, this is certainly something unusual, something that nobody would wake up one morning and think this might happen today. Nobody could picture a molasses flood, and I'll probably be safe to say right now, nobody who's listening to us, or us included, can picture a great molasses flood like this ever happening again.
I honestly couldn't. But here's the thing. I think if you're listening, go ahead and put in Google, type in the Great Boston Molasses Flood. Type it in. I think you'll be shocked by the sheer devastation that it caused, but also to see, because they do have photographs of the silo. That thing was mammoth. To imagine that carried, that thing was in charge of holding all of that molasses is unbelievable. And you know what? Like in my mind, like listening to you tell that story and visualizing it, I mean, I know that there's some people out there who are writers and do scripts and movies and stuff like that who probably listen to our podcast. And thank you for being a part of that. If you're looking for some good story ideas, I mean,
this is it.
I don't know how you would, be able to title that as a movie for TV or theatrical, whatever. But that would be an incredible movie to see. I mean, just the imagery that I'm visualizing in my head, and I have a pretty vivid imagination. I mean, it would be a fascinating story to watch unfold on the big screen.
Potentially, it's a fabulous disaster movie, and it
would be a great disaster
It's based
film.
on true events.
It is. I mean, I could see that, and I remember thinking to myself when I saw the book, I thought, oh, that seems a little bit far-fetched. But having done the research and seen all of the photographs for myself and hearing the descriptions of what happened, holy cow. I mean, that's something else. I have not personally seen a disaster movie like that ever. In some ways, the descriptions that I hear from it almost remind me of The Blob. That gelatinous goop, that rolls over the town and is consuming people, and they're all stuck and dissolving inside of it.
Yeah, that's a fictional thing that sounds awfully close to what really happened.
Well, I mean, The Blob was an alien from outer space, but aside from that, we're talking about this hot sticky mass that just does not have any discrimination as far as who it's going to envelop.
Oh, I know.
And then the way you talked about how they said it was like one of the descriptions described it as flies stuck in sticky paper, and I can see that in my head. I've seen those little sticky strips that you see at gas stations or roadside dining, and you see the little flies in there with their little legs, trying to get out of the sticky paper. And to just like imagine people in that situation, or animals, or
and not being
vehicles.
able to tell, is that an animal or is that a person that's
because you're
floundering
covered.
around?
And if you
and
look,
there's nothing I can do about it.
there's nothing you can't do anything about it, and they're just covered in that. And if you've ever seen molasses, because some people, molasses was a big thing at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Grandma Lewis used molasses, for pancakes and making cookies and stuff like that. But if you haven't seen it, or you've never experienced molasses, it is dark. It is a very dark brown, almost, in some cases, almost black. And it is incredibly sticky. So imagine seeing people or horses or vehicles or buildings covered in this blackish brown goo that's so sticky it's like tar, and you can't move your arms or legs, and you're struggling to pull your... Oh my gosh, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it.
So anyways, what you just said, I hope that if there's a producer connected with Universal Studios listening in, this would be a great Universal Studios disaster movie, because then guess what? You could also create the Great Molasses Flood Disaster Ride.
There you go.
At the Universal theme park.
Hey, and you know what? They got rid of the Great Disaster Ride, so if they're looking for something new, instead of being hit by water coming down in the subway, you can all be hit by molasses.
This is it.
Coming down into the subway.
Oh gosh!
Everybody comes out with little molasses in their hair.
But on a more serious note, as we wrap up this evening, Gary, it just makes you think that when you get up in the morning, you should be thankful that you made it through the night, number one. And number two, you should look forward to making the most of that day, because, nobody saw this coming. No. Nobody saw this as their last day on Earth.
I seriously doubt anybody woke up and thought, today's the day
I'm going to drown in molasses. Yeah, and so it just makes you appreciate what you have and put things in perspective. Hey, listen, if you get stressed out on the job, what does it matter when compared to some event like this?
Oh, my gosh, yeah.
And so, just put everything in perspective and just enjoy your each and every day, and make each and every day a productive one.
Yeah.
And you can't go wrong. A little bit of advice. We don't share too much advice, but a little bit of advice to our folks that we dearly appreciate having with us each and every week.
Because who knows, maybe you could be caught in a flood of marshmallow fluff, or a sea of hot chocolate. You know what though? If a sea of hot chocolate came, I think there'd be quite a few of us running out there. I'm a big chocoholic, so if I have to go, I'll go that way. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well.
Or pizza. If there was a flood of pizza, I don't think I'd complain about that.
No, well.
We'll deal with the mess later, but send me a wave of cheese, sauce, and pepperoni. I'll be fine.
There you go.
I'll make do. I'll eat my way out of it.
Well, anyhow, sometimes incredible stories are so incredible that it's hard to believe they're true. And
I know.
What I have learned just moments ago, while we were involved in this podcast, is the fact that this does have a precedent set in ancient history. I mean, that has to have been very, very similar. Well, it was ash, not molasses, but everything else about the two stories is almost identical.
Well, I think when they said that they came back and they found bodies that were glazed over, because that sugar, once that sugar cools and hardens, it's a shell.
Yeah. And
so you're finding these literally fossilized bodies that are stuck to the street, frozen in the last few minutes of their lives because of this flood. That to me, that's pretty horrific, but because and it very much so in the same way that people had no time to leave Pompeii when the volcano erupted, and they just covered themselves and their children. They were covered in ash, and it froze them like cement in that spot. And anybody who goes there can see those people who are still there to this day, stuck in that one spot.
Let's end on a positive note and remind everybody that today is not the day when a wall of molasses is going to come crashing down on your village.
Thank goodness for that. All right. Well, until next time.
I'm Richard.
I'm Gary. And this truly was an incredible story. Oh, watch out. Here comes the chocolate.